closer?
Yeah, that would be good for the sake of the recording. I'm making an audio recording today because several people actually told me they would not be coming and would appreciate to hear the meeting. So we'll begin by reading the prayer that Father usually recites.
Excuse me, I'm not sick.
That's fine. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who lovest mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge. Open the eyes of our mind to the understanding of thy gospel teachings. Implant also in us the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things as are well pleasing unto thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and unto thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy, good and life-creating Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Okay, good. So I won't have to speak quite so loud.
And then Margaret is coming, right?
No.
Oh, it sounded like...
Well, she said she's leaving, so...
I thought she's...
Good. So last time we finished reading about the witness of John the Baptist, and we also read about the witness of the first disciples, Andrew and then Philip and Nathaniel. And today we'll be starting chapter 2, which is about the first miracle or sign. So the question is, why does John in his gospel be so careful about saying things like on the next day, and today we're here on, it was the third day. So why does he do this? Well, some people say it's because he wants to establish a kind of definite chronology of the events. And that may be true, but there's also a much simpler explanation, which is to do with the way that the manuscript of the Gospel was presented in those days. So if you had a Gospel of St. John manuscript in that time, it was there was no chapter numbers, and there's no verse numbers. These things were added to the Bible much later. There wasn't even any punctuation in the Greek text, and there wasn't uppercase or lowercase letters. It was all one solid block of uppercase Greek letters, if you looked at a page of the Gospel of St. John in those times. So if St. John didn't say things like the next day, it would sound like everything was happening at the same time on the same day. For example, you'd hear something like, "He it is who coming after me is preferred before me, whose shoes latchet I am not worthy to unloose. These things were done in Bethany beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. John seeth Jesus coming unto him, and saith, Behold the Lamb of God, who taketh away the sin of the world." So then I left out what John actually says. He says, these things were done in Bethany beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. The next day, John seeth Jesus coming unto him. So that's the reason why he is very careful about saying the next day. So what we're going to read today is about the miracle at the wedding at Cana. And the first line is, "And on the third day." Now, the third day refers to the third day after the events in the last episode, which was the calling of the disciples. And this is actually the seventh day since the first episode in the Gospel, which was when the men from the Pharisees come to John the Baptist and ask him who he is. So 7 days after that. So day 7, the witness of the first sign, turning water into wine. And on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus and his disciples were called to the wedding. And when the wine was lacking, the mother of Jesus says to him, "They do not have wine." And Jesus says to her, "Woman, what is that to me and to you? My hour has not yet come." His mother says to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do." Now there were 6 stone water jars lying there for the cleansing of the Jews, each having room for 2 or 3 measures. Jesus says to them, "Fill the water jars with water," and they filled them to the top. And he says to them, "Draw it out now and bring it to the head butler." And they brought it. And when the head butler tasted the water which had become wine and did not know where it came from, but the servants knew, the ones who had drawn the water, the head butler calls the bridegroom and says to him, "Every man sets out the good wine first, and when all have gotten drunk, he sets out the poorer wine. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So the final day of this first week of witness takes place on the 3rd day after the events narrated in chapter 1, that is on the 7th day from the first events that I mentioned. Having narrated how John the Baptist witnesses to Jesus' glory as Messiah, how God himself witnesses to it, and how on successive days his new disciples witness to it, John the Evangelist concludes his narration of that glorious week by showing how Christ's miraculous power witnesses to it as well. It is in Cana of Galilee that Christ manifested his glory so that his new disciples believed in him. This is the beginning of the signs and miracles which Jesus did. And it sets the tone for all the signs he will later perform. For it is not a public miracle, but one which is only manifested and known to his disciples. They know of the miracle, the others at the wedding feast do not. To be sure, Christ's subsequent miracles will indeed be seen by all and not just by the disciples. But these later miracles will have this in common with the first sign. They will not fully disclose his messianic glory, but only point to it. That is why John calls them signs, for like signposts, they point to something. Christ's miracles point to his status as Messiah, but they only carry such conviction to those who, like the disciples, approach them with faith. For his disciples, the miracles are manifestations of his glory as Messiah. For the Pharisees, however, they are no such thing, but only evidence that he casts out demons by the ruler of the demons. Thus Christ's messianic status is veiled in this age and disclosed only to those with faith. It is this characteristic of Christ and his miracles that St. John stresses in this account, and throughout his gospel, that his glory is at the same time both revealed and hidden. The fullness of his messianic glory must wait until his hour has come, the hour of his cross and resurrection. In John chapter 17, verse 1, these words spake Jesus, and lift up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour is come. Glorify thy Son, and that thy Son may also glorify thee. John sets the scene by saying that there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and both Jesus and his disciples were called and invited to it. Also, the mother of Jesus was there. Perhaps she was a close friend of the bride, which would account for her knowing about the social catastrophe of them running out of wine before anyone else knew. This was indeed a social catastrophe in a culture which placed such high value on public honour. To run out of wine at such an event would have been to place a cloud over the bridal pair's marriage, such as would not pass away. Wedding banquets lasted for days, and the wine was expected to flow freely. To have the wine lacking meant that the invited guests would begin to leave and would have nothing good to say about the newly married ever after. When the mother of Jesus learns of this from the bride, possibly she whispers to her son, "They do not have wine." That is, she knows he is the chosen Messiah and is calling him to publicly work a miracle, to take this as the moment to declare his messiahship and reveal himself to Israel. Jesus refuses to acquiesce. His hour for such open and undeniable demonstration of his messianic glory has not yet come, and he refuses the summons from his mother. He addresses her respectfully but formally, calling her not mother, the usual warm and filial title, but woman. This does not sound as rude in the original as the English translation does. He calls her woman when consoling her from the cross in chapter 19. Rather, it is like our English title, madam, being polite but also formal and distant. Thus, there is a definite rebuff in the way he addresses her and in his reply as well. What is that to me and to you? In other words, why talk to me about that? Though not rude, his reply is unexpectedly abrupt as he distances himself from her. Mary accepts his word and says to the servants, "Whatever he says to do, do." I think I'll ask someone else to read at this point. It's got to be Ivan, because you've got the book.
You could pass the book.
Yeah, I know we can. I'm just kidding. Yes, that's right.
What is going on here? Some suggest that this is an example of the powerful intercession of the Mother of God. Though Jesus is reluctant to do the miracle, yet he is persuaded to do so by his mother. Though the Theotokos is indeed a powerful intercessor, that is not the meaning of the present story. The point is not that Jesus first refuses a miracle and then changes his mind and does it anyway. It is that Jesus is asked to openly manifest all his glorious Messiah by a public miracle and refuses to do it.
Just speak up as much as you can.
He does the miracle secretly instead, so that none see it but his faithful disciples.
Good.
See, you start to read and everybody comes.
Everyone wants to hear Vanya.
Yeah. See, you stop reading, they went away.
When this is understood, we can understand too why John focused his attention on the mother of Jesus and why Jesus distances himself from her.
Open the circle a little bit.
Okay, carry on.
Prior to this, Jesus was under her authority, as any dutiful son was under the authority of his mother and surviving parent. His mother first assumes that he'll continue to be under her authority, as he always was as a child. But the time for such submission is past. In these days, Jesus is beginning his work and gathering his disciples. Now he is under the authority only of the Father, and Mary, like everyone else in Israel, is called to accept this and become his disciple. That is, she is called to cease being an authority over him and become one who is under him. That is why Jesus distances himself and rebuffs her request. He is not rejecting her, rather he is rejecting her authority over him and calling her to accept his authority over her as his disciple. In In this way, her task mirrors the task of all in Israel. All in Israel see in Jesus simply another Jew, another son of Israel, one who, like them, is subject to all the limitations imposed by Jewish law, such as keeping the Sabbath. Compare chapter 5, verses 16 through 18. Jesus calls them, like Mary, to see him as one who has authority and to bring themselves under his authority. That is why John focuses on Mary early in the story in verse 1. She is mentioned not simply because she is the one who gives Jesus the news that the wine has failed. She is mentioned because she is an image of Israel. She accomplishes the role reversal that all in Israel are called to accomplish. When Jesus begins to exert his authority and gather disciples, she submits to that authority.
Okay, let's pause there. And see if-
Could you repeat the last phrase, the sentence?
When Jesus begins to assert his authority and gather disciples, she submits to that authority.
Okay, she submits. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see if there are any questions which have arisen from that first part of this chapter. Or any comments you want to make on it.
One thing is that with the Theotokos being the surviving parent, that means that at some point in the past, the foster father, whoever we refer to him, Joseph, passed away, and that affects their family life.
How do we know that?
It's sort of implicit that she's the surviving parent, and that the other Joseph isn't there at all, but he was at the beginning.
I suppose Father Lawrence is assuming that since Joseph was not there, he's no longer alive because the family was invited to the wedding. Right?
Well, it doesn't mention his siblings, and it's not likely that they've all died. But so maybe yes, maybe no.
Okay. So let's carry on. Would you like to pass the book to maybe Juliana? Would like to read for a bit?
What's this? Page 42.
We're starting at in this way her task mirrors. Do you find that? We ended on accept his authority over her.
Yeah,
as
and
his
so then
disciple.
wouldn't it, thus as his newest disciple, she tells the servants
No.
further down?
In this way her task?
Well,
Oh, page 41.
so that, and then wouldn't I go on?
No, free.
Ivan, where did you stop? Didn't you
There,
stop there?
yes.
Yeah, so
Sorry about
thus,
that.
All right.
So I thought you were, you just want to skip
Right.
down.
I'm wrong.
Thus, as his newest disciple, she tells the servants of her friend, the bride, to do whatever he says to you. Though not knowing what her son might do, she is confident he will help, for she, of all people, knows his heart. Her insight is correct, and he comes to the aid of the bridal pair. In that place where there were 6 stone water jars lying there, which were used for the cleansing of the Jews. This water would have been used for the ceremonial washing of the guests' hands, which formed part of the ritual of every meal. Each water jar had room for 2 or 3 measures, 20 or 30 gallons. He instructed the servants to fill the water jars with water, perhaps adding some to the jars which had been partially emptied, and then to bring some of that newly filled water to the head butler, that is, to the one who was charged by the bridegroom with the task of coordinating the feast. St. John, ever with the eye for detail, says that they filled them right up to the top. The servants brought it as the Lord ordered, and the head butler was delighted to have this unexpected supply of good wine. He did not know where the wine came from. He only knew when he tasted it that it was good. He calls the bridegroom over to him and congratulates him on the vintage, though he comments on the bridegroom's strange arrangements. Usually, he says, doubtless taking another long sip, every man sets out the good wine first, and when all have gotten drunk and can't tell the good wine from the bad, he sets out the poorer wine. You have kept the good wine until now. What odd festal arrangements, he says, as he drains his cup. John delights in the irony of the story. The head butler, who had charge of the feast, did not know, though the servants knew, since they were the ones who had drawn the water. The bridal pair doubtless knew too, as did the Lord's disciples. It is to them, with their faith, that he manifested his glory, so that they now truly believed in him. They could see how the water of Judaism, imaged by the 6 stone water jars for Jewish rites of purification, was to be transformed by Christ into the rich, heady wine of the kingdom. As Christ changed water into wine, so would he change the lives of those in Israel who knew only the law, into lives replete with the glory of God.
Let's carry on and get to the end of that section, please, Juliana.
After this sign, Christ went down to Capernaum, doubtless to visit the families of Simon and Andrew, James and John, since that is where they lived and had their business. He probably went away by Nazareth, since John mentions that his brothers went with him. It would seem as if his disciples, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, prevailed on him and his mother to come visit their families and bring his own kin along too. Having become enthusiastic disciples of the Master, the one able to do such wonders, they wanted their families to be as close as possible. Christ obliged them with a visit, though a short one, since they remained not many days. Why does John the Evangelist mention this? By mentioning Jesus' disciples as joining with his mother and brothers, John wants to make the point that discipleship to Christ means becoming part of his family. That is why, at the end of his ministry, Christ entrusts his mother to the beloved disciple, John himself. All who believe in him are one family, and the closest of familial ties bind them all in one.
Okay, we'll just read what John says in chapter 19. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples standing by whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then saith he to his disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her into his own home. So this is a reference to John himself, of course, and the Theotokos.
The cross.
Okay, so any questions or comments on that part? Some very nice symbolism here between the water and the wine, symbolizing the old law of Judaism and the new teaching about the kingdom of God.
What does the water symbolize? Just in ritual?
Well, that's what it was there for, is for the Jews to wash their hands before eating. We should notice that Christ's disciples don't do this later on.
They're called on it, right?
Because they're kind of no longer part of the old dispensation of the law. There's a new teaching symbolized by the wine.
One of the things that stuck out to me was the very short Father Lawrence saying that servants brought to the Lord right as delighted the head butler was delighted to taste the good supply of good wine, didn't know where it came from. He only knew that he tasted it and that it was good. Stuck out to me because Christ in that moment in time was manifest as creator. And so his first act was creation. his first miracle, and that was a microcosm of back in Genesis. He created everything and it was good.
Yeah.
So it was a more of a prayer that was offered, a thanksgiving that was offered back to Christ, that it was good, meaning it was good. So to have that really short affirmation, that's sort of, I almost missed it, but just that exclamation of the head butler saying, affirming that this creation is good.
Well, and also that specific creation of wine for the celebration of a marriage feast, and that one line where it says, they could see how the water of Judaism, imaged by the 6 stone water jars for Jewish rites of purification, was to be transformed by Christ into the rich, heady wine of the kingdom.
It's transformed.
And into the kingdom, meaning that the creation of the kingdom was instituted by he who creates. So it's just a really neat, going back to what Seraphim was saying at the very first meeting, that it kind of calls back on the very first couple of verses in his gospel of calling back to the point of creation, being
Back to Genesis.
back to Genesis.
But that's an interesting point that you're making, John, in saying that the water, Christ didn't create as God created in the beginning from nothing, but he transformed his creation from water, purification rites, the law, into wine,
A new life.
a new life.
And a fountain of blood and water. It's the blood of the grape. And do you want to drink of this baptism too? You know, it's going back and forth. And,
When using using physical artifacts of purification from the first covenant to then be the harbinger of the second covenant, it's just kind of cool.
Nothing's not physical.
It's kind of cool.
Sorry.
That's kind of cool. Yeah. Well, taste and see that the Lord is good.
That's what was echoing in my
Yeah.
mind too.
And the creation doesn't stop. It's always going on. God creating. It's not like it happened and that was it. So it's
You just hear all this stuff.
The well that never, what was that? You drink and you don't want to be, you're not
never
thirsty.
goes dry.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, the Samaritan woman.
The Samaritan
Give me that water so that I may drink and never be thirsty.
And the water being maybe coming from the earthen jars. And yeah, it's just,
yeah.
anyway.
I never got this. Oh yeah, the wedding and so what? And it's like, oh, that's just all in the feast.
There's a lot of subtlety in the way that he writes these things. So do you mind if he keeps your book? Do you want to read for a bit?
Oh, sure.
So starting section 3, Christ's ministry to Israel. This is about the cleansing of the temple.
Starting at St. John relates.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Christ's ministry to Israel, first visit to Jerusalem, Passover, cleansing the temple, and the ensuing controversy. St. John relates a cleansing of the temple during this early time, occurring even before Christ came into Galilee and began his ministry in earnest. That is, it is related as occurring a good 3 years before the cleansing of the temple recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, which is recorded as happening during the final days of the Lord's life prior to his crucifixion. See Mark 11:15 through 18. though some have thought it unlikely that such an event would happen twice, and that therefore either John or the Synoptic Gospels have erred in recording when it happened, it is apparent that these were two different events. The Synoptic Gospels all record Christ as quoting Isaiah 56:7 about the temple being a house of prayer for all nations, and saying that the temple has been made into a thieves' cave. The Johannine account does not mention this. St. John mentions that Christ made a scourge from ropes, chapter 2, verse 15. The Synoptics do not mention this. In John's account of the early cleansing, the reaction of those in the temple is simply to challenge Jesus to 18 verse 20. Chapter 2, verses 18 to 20. In the Synoptic accounts, the reaction is a determination to destroy him, Mark 11:18. These reactions are quite consistent with the timing. When this first cleansing occurred, Christ had not yet begun his own ministry. That occurred only after John had been imprisoned, Mark 1:14. When Christ cleansed the temple this first time, he was considered by most to have been John the Baptizer's disciple, and John's immense popularity doubtless protected Jesus from more extreme consequences from the temple authorities. At the time of his second cleansing of the temple at the end of his ministry, Jesus had been antagonizing the authorities for many months. And it was, and it was to be expected that his cleansing of the temple would result not just in their challenging his authority to do so, but in their determination to destroy him. Some have thought it unlikely that if Jesus cleansed the temple, the abuses would return. But nothing is more likely. After Jesus returned to Galilee, the money changers would doubtless return, probably immediately and certainly within an interval of 3 years. Also, if it had been 3 years since Christ uttered his enigmatic saying about raising up the sanctuary after it had been torn down, it would be reasonable that those who heard it such a long time before would not be able to accurately remember at his trial. Compare Mark chapter 14, verse 57 to 59. If he had uttered this saying a mere week before, the failure of witnesses to report it accurately would be harder to account for. In short, everything in the Gospels points to this event being a separate one from the later cleansing narrated by the Synoptics.
Okay, go ahead and just read the actual Gospel and then we'll stop for a pause.
Sure. And the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple the ones selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the coin dealers seated. And having made a scourge out of ropes, he cast out all from the temple, both the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to the ones selling the doves he said, "Take these things from here. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "The zeal for your house will eat me up." The Jews therefore answered and said to him, "What sign do you show us that you do these things?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews therefore said, 46 years was this sanctuary in building, and you yourself will raise it up in 3 days. But that one was speaking of the sanctuary of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken.
Thank you, Isaac. So that
Could I bring up? Oh.
yeah, go ahead.
This is going back to just the beginning of the wedding of Canaan. And it's something that's always puzzled me about was Jesus rebukes his mother rather badly and certainly impolitely. I wondered why John would have put that in to the account. And his mother, it's interesting, is portrayed as, you have to fill in the blanks because there's so many blanks in it, but it's as if she just absolutely didn't hear any of the rebuke. And then and then tells the people, do exactly as he tells you. And my question is, what the heck's going on there? Because, and I don't know. I don't know whether it's a comment about the tradition and relationship between mother and son back in those days, or what.
She seems
Why is that
Yeah.
there? And it's kind of interesting because that little exchange is almost sort of like a pivot of a seesaw. There's something about it that seems very important, but you can't. And then it goes on, and the miracle sort of is elucidated. So I just wonder if anybody has any view on that particular question and how it would affect. It certainly affects the story in an incredibly powerful way because it brings energy into it that ordinarily would, well, I could feel in part of me very critical of it.
You touched upon some of it.
You know, she does seem to have an understanding that he will do something to rectify the situation on a physical level, even though he says, you know, my time has not come to actually manifest my full messiahship. Mm-hmm. He will still do something to, as it were, undercover to, you know, fix the problem, which he does. You know. So she apparently intuitively or in some way grasps that without actually having to ask him or discuss that with him.
I mean, when I said formality, I mean like that's she can just kind of brush what he says aside because it's like he's saying that his saying that is like a formality. Like my time's has not come, but again, she knows him better than anyone, so she knows what he will do.
I like it. These are my mommy issues. But Moses and, just as examples, Moses and Abraham at different times, and I think others too, ask God. God says, I'm going to do this. And they ask him in different ways to repent of to change his mind. But Mary's a mother, and this is my emotional take. She submits to his will with motherly boldness. I don't take it as a brush off. He calls her woman out of respect. She doesn't say, no, son, you're wrong. She submits to his authority. She didn't command him to do anything. He has authority and she says nothing. She always says nothing. She always holds everything inside. And then she looks and says, do whatever he tells you. Yeah. He doesn't assume that he's going to say anything.
she lets him do whatever he will or won't.
But this is very important in our faith, right? I mean, look at the hymnography we have about Theotokos. How she's able to, intercede with her son because she has the authority of a mother over her son. So she intercedes for us, and that's why we can pray to her.
And she doesn't even have words. She didn't have to say
No,
words.
it doesn't have to.
She just knows
Right.
who he is.
Your Son and our God.
So the zeal for your house will eat me up, he says.
Something that I've wondered about that later in the gospel, where maybe not St. John's, but where Christ is on trial and they bring in false witnesses that say, this man said that destroy the temple and he'll raise it in 3 days. And I thought, but that wasn't false. That part wasn't false. I mean, it's like the example that they use. It's like, well, he did say that. So just, I don't know, just an aside, but I always thought it was interesting that they chose that example.
Yeah, so Psalm 69, verse 9, for the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, and the reproaches of them that reproach thee are fallen upon me. This is when David is kind of accused of being a bit obsessed with building the temple in the first place. He says, the zeal for thy house has eaten me up. So this is what the disciples are thinking of when Jesus makes these statements about the temple.
Yeah, I thought there was only one incident of him cleansing the temple. I didn't.
Yeah, me too.
Was there more than one?
There's two.
Well, that's embarrassing.
There's evidence that there's two.
Father Valentin, the only thought that I have about the sort of Theotokos maybe not getting brushed off, but his telling her that his minister's not ready, and then her saying, do what he tells you. That it almost seems like later times where he was healing the blind, or he would heal the lame, and he would charge them not to tell anybody, but they went and told people anyway.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So it's sort of I don't know if that's how many times John has that as sort of a device, or if that's something that he wanted to start early on, of having Christ say one thing and yet his creation, goes and does something else, but I don't know if that's the case here.
Interesting.
Okay, anything else?
I thought the lilies of the field and how God provides things not only through people's ordinary way, but also like miracles more frequently than is expected.
Do you want to lend your book again to Nadine?
Sure.
So on page 47, just after this, Jesus went up to Jerusalem.
I'm going to start up at that right there.
Yeah.
Jesus went up to Jerusalem for the Passover of the Jews. Pause. He found in the temple courts the ones selling oxen and sheep and doves and the coin dealers seated at their tables, changing local currency into the currency accepted in the temple. This was a comparatively recent abuse. Animals were also sold on the nearby Mount of Olives for use in sacrifice. and coin dealers were available to convert the various currencies into the coinage accepted in the temple. The existence of animal sellers and coin dealers was not the problem. The problem was the presence of these things within the temple courts themselves. That's italicized, within the temple courts themselves. The authorities had allowed these stalls to be set up within the court of the Gentiles, which was the only place the Gentiles had to pray within the temple courts. The presence of such commerce turned the sacred place of prayer into an oriental bazaar and made their prayer there impossible. The house of the Father had been thus degraded into a common house of trade and haggling business. Oh, the Greek word is emporion. Not emporion, okay. No wonder Christ was incensed at this recent abuse. So it was that he made a scourge out of ropes and used it to cast out all from the temple, whipping the animals, both the sheep and the oxen, to drive them away. These stampeding beasts were followed by their owners, who chased after them, which is why the all is in the masculine in the Greek, pantas and not panta, for it refers to all the people there along with their sheep and oxen. This is not an act of anger or violence directed at the animals, but rather is the only way to make the animals leave, as anyone who has tried to herd such creatures knows. He then poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables to drive them out as well. He directed the astonished coin dealers, who no doubt rose up incredulous from their seats, to take those things from here in the temple courts and stop making the house of his Father into a common emporium. We note that Christ refers to God as my Father and not our Father or your Father, for he is claiming a special relationship to God not shared by anyone else. It is as the Son of God that he dares to cleanse the house of his Father. In narrating the story, St. John recounts the first time Christ entered into public controversy with the Jews. He does so to show how the certainty of the cross was there at the beginning, and how it cast its long shadow over all Christ's ministry. The crucifixion was not a late development. It was foreordained from the beginning and was inevitable as soon as he began to do the Father's will. When the divine light came into the darkness, there could be no other final result. Thus, the disciples later, after his resurrection, remembered that it was written in Psalm 69, "The zeal for your house will eat me up." That is his final destruction, that which would later eat him up and consume him at the cross, was beginning even then. His zeal to do his Father's will and care for his house made it inevitable. I just was thinking of how maybe that was one reason why he didn't immediately say, "Sure, I'll perform my first miracle," because according to this, as soon as he would start that, then he's on the path to the cross. So I just wonder if that was part of his, but nonetheless, he went ahead with it.
It was a secret miracle, as it were, not a public miracle.
Yeah, but it's limited to those, the servants and his disciples. As he stood in the temple courts, surrounded by surprised worshippers, some Jews came to challenge him. Only a prophet had the right to overturn the decisions of the high priests and the temple authorities. What sign did he show them that he was in fact such a prophet that he dared to do these things? The cross was even then showing itself as a future certainty through their challenge. The hard-heartedness which allowed the abuse and prompted the challenge would later cause them to destroy and crucify the sanctuary of his body. Yet even after they did this, in 3 days he would raise it up. His resurrection would prove once and for all his authority to cleanse the temple. They did not understand the saying at all. and what would become a pattern, and then there's a lot of references. They insisted on understanding his words carnally in the crassest, most physical way. When he challenged them to destroy the sanctuary, promising that in 3 days he would raise it up, they assumed that he was referring to the temple he had just cleansed. That temple was 46 years in building and was even then not finished. And Jesus was claiming he could build it himself in a mere 3 days. They thought this to be insane pride. They also thought he was evading their challenge. They had demanded that he perform a miracle right there and then to vindicate and prove his authority. This he would always refuse to do, for that would be to confirm them in their delusion that he was accountable to them in their wickedness. Yet he was not refusing their challenge, nor failing to give proof. His resurrection, when it came, would be proof enough for any. However, when he said, "Destroy the sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up," it must have seemed to them as if he chose this test for the express purpose of avoiding the test, as if to say, if you would just destroy the temple, I would rebuild it. But since you can't destroy the temple, well, obviously I can't rebuild it. The confrontation therefore ended in a stalemate, since they did not understand that the one, the emphatic pronoun is used in the Greek, was speaking of the sanctuary of his body, not the temple buildings themselves.
An interesting section, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, hi.
Any other questions and comments on this section?
Since there are two separate, we're assuming there are two separate times where he cleansed the temple. I know that one of those times it was aimed at the high priest, and I don't know if that's this time or if it was the first time. But I read somewhere that one of the reasons he did that was because after the Maccabean revolt, I think, when the Jews were trying to reclaim they were too poor to farm their own land, and so they would sell it to the temple, and the temple would then hold it. They would be the leaseholders, and then would hire the people to essentially tend their own, tend the flocks and the animals that would then be sold at the temple, and that this was an abomination because the Levites basically were overstepping their boundaries. They basically were robbing the land that God gave to the to Israel at time of Exodus or the Torah. So I don't know if that's this time, and he would say that's why when he said, you made this into a den of robbers. So he drove out the animals that were supposed to belong to the people that they belonged to, the tribes, but that were being taken from them by the temple. And that's why there's the flipping of the tables, taking out the and that really made the landholders, that is the priesthood, pretty mad, because that's he was coming for their pocketbooks at that.
Yeah, that's right. There's an interesting Old Testament reference here that has a certain prophetic quality. It's from the book of Malachi, chapter 3. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom you delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi, the priesthood, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. So it's kind of a bit of background as why he says here, no wonder Christ was incensed at this recent abuse by the priesthood.
There's a little line in there that jumped out at me that I'd never heard before, where when you're reading it, said that the priests would have submitted to a higher authority, to a prophet. But when did anybody ever listen to a prophet?
Yeah,
Like, how do we determine, when they say, what's your, what sign do you show? But it had never had occurred to me that the priests that would be an authority for them.
Yes, right, yeah, I noticed that too. Lazarus Saturday, because even though he called forth Lazarus, who had been dead 4 days, somewhere right in that little story, there's something about people doubting. People who had been there still doubted. Even witnessing that, or, it's, yeah.
Oh, can you say that one more time?
Well, that apparently some of the people who were present when Christ called forth Lazarus from the grave doubted
Right.
doubted that he was the
Yeah.
Christ. And
Yeah.
so, like you said, perform a sign. It's like, well, what more do you want?
Yeah. I'm trying to sit there and go, well, what would I have thought?
Oh,
Because
gosh.
we just were bought in.
Yeah,
CGI.
I'm afraid to even go there.
I would have, was it just Houdini? Was it just misdirection? Was it some magic trick?
Computer generated.
I wouldn't assume that the guy was really, I don't think I would have believed that he brought that guy back from the dead. Never having.
Yeah, who knows?
I think he would have to trusted him from the beginning. I don't believe
Yeah.
anything. I don't trust it. I don't know.
All right, so let's wrap it up there for this week.
Thank you.
No worries. So next meeting will be after Pascha on the 12th of May. This is the Sunday after Pascha. And after that will be the 26th of May.
So that the 12th, that's, I know this, the Easter egg hunt, but is that also that's St. Thomas Sunday? Is it that one day people go to the Clodbisher, to the cemetery?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So
It's usually not until
mid-afternoon?
1:30.
Yeah, late,
Usually we meet at the monastery, at the cemetery at 1:30.
Okay, that still could be doable then.
Okay, just so that we're aware of that.
All right, so should we finish with
Sure. Yeah, Tom 3.